to you both, Emmanuel and Ismail, and welcome to my presentation for THSR302, Comparative Abrahamic Religions. This is my assessment for Task 2, the second part of the series, which provides a deeper elaboration upon findings in Part 1. My name is Jack, and it is my pleasure to be providing insight on both the Quranic and biblical accounts of the Aqidah through a comparative study. So today I will be engaging both Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through to 9, and I'll be using the New Revised Standard Version. Quranic text, I shall be exploring Surah As-Safat, chapter 8, verse 83 through to 113, using of course the Abd al-Halim translation. Now I will be conducting the comparative analysis of both the Quranic and biblical text of the story of the intended sacrifice of Abraham's child. So here is some provided background on the sacrifice, which I am certain that you would already know. So within the biblical narrative, the significance of Abraham's sacrifice is framed by the events of Genesis 21, where it is revealed to Abraham, or revealed that Abraham has two sons, Ishmael, born of his servant Hagar, and Isaac, born of Sarah in her old age. Now, at Sarah's urging, Abraham is directed to send Hagar and Ishmael away, a moment some interpret as a theological precursor to the emergence of the Islamic tradition. It is in Genesis 22 that introduces the profound theme of a divine test, wherein God tests Abraham's covenantal faithfulness. Here we see Abraham's unwavering obedience that is culminated in his willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac, an act that epitomizes radical trust and submission to God's divine will. Now he is instructed to journey to Mount Moriah across 3 days, a site rich in theological symbolism and often interpreted as, in the Hebrew, to be seen by God or to be chosen by God, and traditionally linked to the land of myrrh, potentially foreshadowing themes of sacrifice and consecration. Now, Christians would paint this scene to be a prefigurement of the messianic prophecy, and this notion of being chosen by God is also a focal point for Muslim adherents as well. However, this will be addressed further throughout this presentation. So, returning back to the Christian and Jewish entities, we acknowledge that such a sacrifice plays a pivotal and poignant role of faithful submission. As such, Abraham obeyed this commanding word of God and offers his son before being stopped by an angel in Genesis 22. Now, within the Quranic text and the Quranic tradition, Ibrahim is confronted by his society, including his own father, a people steeped in heresy and apostasy, worshipping false gods and idols. Now, in response, Ibrahim challenges their beliefs and affirms his exclusive devotion to one God, who is Allah. Now, as a result, he is rejected, mocked for his old age and infirmity, and ultimately cast into a blazing fire by his own people. Despite this, Allah delivers him unharmed from the furnace, a sign of divine favor and vindication. Now, the Quranic tradition also signifies Ibrahim's unwavering faith and mistrial, highlighting him being rewarded with the gift of a son, that he is honored as a righteous exemplar who triumphed in the face of spiritual corruption. So, having a look at some of the similarities, we first turn to the Quranic literature, where it says, "We called out to him, Ibrahim, you have fulfilled the dream." Now, the idea is that God tested Abraham, and such a test was presented through a dream to determine his true character. And similarly, we observe this in the biblical account as well, where it says, "After all these things, God tested Abraham, saying to him, 'Abraham.' And Abraham responds, 'Here I am.' To which God says, 'Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah.'" Now here we also discover another similarity, being that Abraham ransoms his son as a momentous sacrifice, which led to his family succeeding generations. And in so this idea that a sacrifice was offered, and in that sense both the Christian and Quranic texts elaborate that Abraham saw a sacrificial lamb for the burnt offering, which is present in Genesis 22:6-7. We also assert an assertion where God gives a family of abundance that shall succeed generations, where it says, "We gave Abraham the good news of Isaac, a prophet and a righteous man." Now, here we see through a Jewish and Christian recognition that Isaac is also presented as an offspring who is indeed blessed by God, who obviously is the father of the people of Israel, who is loved further in the covenant. There are also a considerable amount of differences that exist between both the biblical and Quranic accounts, both in historical material and literary structure. Here we see the first major difference that we notice is that Abraham is calling the people who he deems are the people of God out of heresy because of their falsehood. This is a direct correlation to that of Exodus 23, where Moses commands the people of Israel out of heresy for worshipping false gods. We see Abraham inexcusing his people, including his biological father, questioning how and why they choose to worship false gods over one true God. Now the collective was unimpressed and built a fiery furnace to place Abraham into. And this mirrors the events in the book of Daniel, where Nebuchadnezzar places the three faithful into the furnace. Interestingly, upon translating the Babylonian names of the three to their Hebrew origins, we derive three meanings. We have Hananiah, meaning God is gracious; Mishael, who is to be like God; and Azariah, meaning God has helped. Abraham, like the three, demonstrated these qualities and was protected by the hand of God that divinely intervened and rewarded Abraham with a son. One particular distinction that struck me was that Ibrahim and his son are portrayed as equal participants in the unfolding of the Quranic narrative. Within this account, it is specified that when the boy was old enough to work, Ibrahim said to his son, "I've seen a dream of sacrificing you." And the son replied, "You know, father, do as what God commands you." And so in that sense, they are revered as equal partners in the eyes of Allah. Ibrahim envisions the dream, and Isaac in some way interprets this dream. Now, I personally would argue that this is quite different to the account that we see in Genesis, where God is actually testing Abraham in that sense, and God commands Abraham, "Take your son, who you love, specifically to Mount Moriah, to sacrifice him as a burnt offering to prove your love for me." Now, we observe that Abraham specifically, carries out the sacrificial preparation over a 3-day duration. And when Abraham and Isaac journey to Mount Moriah, it is Abraham who carries the wood, builds the physical altar, creates the fire, and at sunset actually binds Isaac, who at this point is to be sacrificed. And then at the climax of this event, an angel of the Lord appears saying, "Abraham, do not sacrifice this boy, and an offering has been placed for you." We now turn to part 3, which explores the contributions of Ayaz Afsar, who offers valuable historical context and examines the relationships between the Quranic and biblical portrayals of the historical sacrificial event of the Aqdah. So here, Afsar makes notable the intense sacrifice of Ishmael within the Quranic account when compared to that of Isaac in Genesis. He reveals that both are regarded as chosen sons deemed worthy ransoms for sacrifice due to the many similarities that they share, as previously discussed. Now, the biblical narrative account remarks the literal action of sacrifice as an event in the life of Abraham as the fulfillment of the covenant that he has to his descendants. Also recognized as an important historical event in the church's history, whereas the Quran proposes the idea that the sacrifice of Ishmael, which, who is believed to be, the son in this respective account, is desired to consult their prophet, so not to lose heart in this time of trouble. Now, I personally found the focus of the historical accounts, as well as the role of narration, quite fascinating, where the biblical narration for the account of the Aqdah takes place in the third person, where God, in this sense, doesn't really play an active role, but is more just telling, what Abraham is doing. And we also see this here, as Afsar remarks in Genesis 6:6, the Lord regretted that he had made man on earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Now, the point of comparison is where the Quran reveals God having an active role, in contrary to not having so much an active role within the biblical account. It is also here where Afsar notes that the biblical account of Isaac's sacrifice offers insight into the inner thoughts of his characters, allowing readers to access their emotional and spiritual states. Though this prevents presenting a fully fleshed out account. It's a bit ambiguous. But in contrast, the Quranic narration of Ishmael's intended sacrifice is marked by its clarity and directedness, offering a straightforward and easy followed portrayal grounded in objective narration. Afsar also draws attention to the differing narrative orientations between the biblical and Quranic accounts as represented in Table 3. I find this observation to be quite fascinating, as Afsar notes that the biblical account provides full details of persons, places, time, articles, objects, and animals, while the Quranic version deliberately avoids such detail. Instead, however, it offers minimal information, leading to Afsar to conclude that it is better to say that it alludes to the story rather than telling it. Now, personally, I believe that this could be an intentional choice, that the Quran restricts narrative detail to preserve theological focus, choosing to favor allusions over elaboration to direct attention to the moral and spiritual essence of the story, rather than it's being caught up in the historical details and nitty-gritties of the text. There are also literary commentaries and the comparison of material that is evaluated where we see that the choice of literary techniques such as that depicted here in Table 5, Afsar makes out that biblical narration doesn't comment or evaluate its roles of its characters. And while Afsar argues that the biblical narration doesn't comment or evaluate its characters, I would argue that the biblical account of the Akedah actually communicates profound theological evaluation, albeit through the structure and intertextual resonances rather than explicit commentary. As we see in Hebrews 11:17-19, for instance, it reinterprets the event to emphasize Abraham's faith, trust, and obedience, suggesting that his actions prefigure resurrection, as though Isaac had really died and had been raised to life. Now, this is also backed by Kessler, who points out that both Hebrews and James' book saw Genesis 22 as Christologically significant, and that Abraham's obedience reflects a true response to divine testing through the steadfastness and obedience. Now, these are deeply evaluative reflections that shape the reader's moral and theological understanding of the characters. Moreover, I find the concept of zekut avot, meaning the merit of the fathers, actually attests to the enduring consequence of Abraham's action, offering historical and redemptive benefit to Israel, especially regarding forgiveness of sins and Israel's redemption. Now, early church fathers like Basil of Zahuja extended this further, viewing Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son through typology. What Abraham was willing to do on Moriah, God actually did it on Golgotha. Now, I also align my understanding with Koller's view that the Quranic emphasis on Ishmael as a co-equal with Abraham does not fully account for the covenantal and typological implications of Isaac's sacrifice in Genesis. Additionally, many Jewish interpretations highlight Sarah's silent yet significant role, often drawing parallels between Sarah at the Akedah and Mary at the crucifixion, which adds another layer of typological richness absent from the purely objective reading. And in this light, the biblical narrative may be sparse in direct commentary, but I find it to be deeply evaluative in its theological framing and intertextual development. But moving aside from this, I would like to respectively point out that Afsar also remarks that in the story that the persons, places, and events are implemented, however, certain traits are not, and he says that the Quranic texts don't include mentioning of certain people or places, but rather really highlight the actions of Abraham in this story. Moving on to part 4, we direct our attention to the findings of Aaron Koller, a Jewish scholar who provides context on the Akedah account. Now, I actually thoroughly enjoyed this video and found it quite insightful, as Koller begins his presentation by affirming the accounts of Ibrahim's sacrifice of his son, where Ibrahim fought against heresy from both his father and the people around him, and for such Ibrahim was forced into a fire to perish, but through divine intervention was saved and granted a child, as I have previously mentioned. So the Islamic account of the sacrifice of Ibrahim's child takes place within a divine dream, which Koller stresses on this notion of it being within a dream. He also emphasizes that the son's identity is not coherently revealed, so we are left the audience is left to decipher whether the son mentioned is in fact Ishmael or Isaac. Now, I would argue that it's crucial to note that Ibrahim discloses his dream to his son, whom the son interprets the same dream to his father. Now, both the father and the son submit to this dream, accepting its fulfillment. Just as Ibrahim is about to sacrifice his son, Allah provides a sacrificial ram as a substitute, and as shown in the illustrations, Koller references a 16th century manuscript from Istanbul, Turkey, which depicts this moment, highlighting Ibrahim's obedience and the divine provision of a ram through God or an angel. So this significant theme that Koller presents is the prophetic dream that encapsulates the Quranic account, and we also gauge this from a Jewish perspective as well, that Abraham was also accounted to have a prophetic dream in the biblical account. Now, from this stem some ideas or propositions that the Judeo-Christian account could have also been within a dream. And I found this quite an intriguing thought that really hones in on the idea that the Islamic account is represented through an artwork. And this ambiguity in its normative value allows the narrative to be interpreted differently according to the individual. Koller also proposes that within the Quranic account, the son's interpretation of the dream and his communication of it to his father suggests that he is an equal partner in Abraham's salvific story. This stands in contrast to the Jewish and Christian narratives, where Abraham and Isaac are portrayed as distinct figures with clearly defined roles. One as the sacrificer and the other as the one to be sacrificed. And upon critically analyzing this mosaic picture designed in Lisbon in Portugal by the Ottomans, the roles in the Islamic account are coherently and notably depicted. As we approach our conclusion, we observe that the biblical narrative presents the sacrifice of the ram not as a direct command from God, but as something Abraham discovers after being stopped by the angel. Now, Koller affirms this view, stating that the sacrifice of a ram cannot replace a divine command, and that the angel does not offer the ram, but it was simply appeared and is presented for Abraham to see. In comparison to this, the Quranic text suggests that the ram was divinely provided as a substitute for the son's ransom. This is a view supported by many scholars, both Jewish and Muslim. Now, this idea parallels certain Christian interpretations where the ram is seen as a sacrifice offered by Abraham on behalf of his son. And again, I find this interesting, and upon doing further research, I found that there is a festival in the Islamic tradition known as the sacrifice of Ibrahim, which complements the pilgrimage of Hajj between Mecca and Medina. So during this festival, a ram is slaughtered as an offering to remind adherents that we see this practice or ritual in correlation to Surah As-Safat in verses 83 to 113. Now, Koller further comments on the Quranic verse about Ibrahim and Ishmael raising the house in chapter 17, verse 17. This proposition proposes the construction of a literal house, referring to the Kaaba, which resides in Mecca, and Jewish scholars also support this idea. I was doing some reading as well, and I came across this concept of temple cosmology, where a temple is a model of the cosmos, of the universe, whereby appointed agents, priests or priestesses enter to approach the divine, and they were essentially gates to heaven, Now, what occurs in a temple is supposed to occur in the transcendent realm as well. So if the mountains such as Mount Moriah reflect the pillars that separate heaven and hell, then I find it fascinating that Abraham is the closest that he can be to God or be to heaven, yet an angel is the being that delivers the message to prevent him from sacrificing Isaac. And I also find that within the Hebrew language, it's fascinating that in the Bereshit, using the terms such as Vihalelu Shayam, and take now thy son, thine only son, whom thou love, Isaac, and go toward the place of Moriah, meaning the land of God or the land of the vision, which could possibly be prefiguring Yeshua's sacrifice in the New Testament at Calvary, but the translation also meaning or referring to the prophetic vision that we see within the Quranic account. Me to the conclusion of my presentation, and I would just like to say thank you for your time for listening to my presentation for assessment 2. I will now show you my bibliography. Thank you.